I'll just turn things over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, welcome again, everyone, and those who may not have caught my introduction. My name is Brittany Riley, and I am a faculty member at Marshall University School of Pharmacy. I am a pharmacist by training, but I was asked to come speak, and now it seems like forever ago in getting this set up, but I was asked to come speak because myself and actually a colleague probably of some of you all who are here today at WVU, Erin Winstanley, worked with, actually, it was a CTSI grant, and it was called Technology Assisted Prescription Opioid Safety Education, and you can go on to the next slide. It was supported, like I said, by the WVCTSI grant, and there's our study team, and we could have not done this work without all of those individuals helping us and the CTSI support. Go on to the next slide. But we realized that, you know, the opioid epidemic, non-medical use of prescription opioids was a problem, while also realizing that there are instances where an opioid may be necessary. You know, we know that there is that sweet spot, and so what we wanted to aim to do was to make sure that patients receive proper education on how to safely use the opioids that they were prescribed. Because we know that not a lot of people get great education, or there's a lot of scare tactics, etc. And so that's kind of what we aim to do. You can go on to the next slide. So what the whole purpose of our project was a self-management intervention to deliver universal education, and also a mechanism to initiate discussion on non-medical use of prescription opioids, addiction, and overdose for the patients who are receiving prescription opioids. We also aim to improve the safe use, storage, and disposal of prescription opioids to reduce non-medical use, opioid use disorders, and adverse events. A lot of the current efforts on the education on safe use of opioids tends to be aimed at the providers. So making sure that the providers are prescribing it appropriately, that they are doing their due diligence. And while that's very important, there's also we're educating the providers on when to prescribe it, when to not. We need to make sure we're educating our patients with good factual information and just not, you know, stigmatized information or fear-mongering information when they're prescribed it. And there's really not something that's been empirically tested for patients specifically on prescription opioid safety. You can go on to the next slide. So Dr. Winstanley, before she came to WVU, had worked with Mercy Health in Cincinnati, and they used pharmacy students to screen patients receiving prescription opioids out of the ER at Mercy Health, and screening with previous experience of taking prescription opioids, knowledge of side effects, and then also screening for the presence of adverse effects if they were already taking them. They also provided a scripted counseling that could be tailored as kind of like a, you know, choose your own adventure. Like if they tell you this, then you go to this portion of the scripted counseling. And then provided educational materials in the form of brochures to those patients. You can go on to the next slide. So it included, the scripted counseling included information on opioid use, so safety, proper disposal, the side effects of opioids, and then how to use naloxone. Information on opioid overdoses, such as signs and symptoms, what would happen if you mix drugs, tolerance, health conditions, etc. And then a section on naloxone. You can go on to the next slide. And these are just kind of some of the informational, educational materials that they used in that project. So as Dr. Winstanley finished up this project, she got her position at WVU, moved to Morgantown, and actually presented at a CTSI meeting where we both were at. And so my background, what kind of got me started in this area, was I am our screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment champion for the School of Pharmacy. And so when I saw her work, we met up, we talked, and I'm like, this would go great with some of the things that I'm starting to teach our students on screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. Let's find a way to collaborate. And so then Tpose, the technology assisted prescription opioid safety, was born. You can go on to the next slide. Here, I jumped the gun a little bit on the story of how Tpose started, but they did find that the counseling in the original Pose results took from anywhere from 2 to 25 minutes. The majority of patients had previously received an opioid pain medication and were able to list at least one side effect, and they were aware of the risk of overdose, and that they reported that they preferred talking to the pharmacist and receiving the educational materials more than talking to the pharmacist or educational materials alone. You can go on to the next slide. And these were the topics covered, with the most of them being opioid safety precautions, opioid side effects, and giving them the opioid safety brochure. You can go on to the next slide. They found in their study that the blue bar is the risk of addiction associated with opioids for themselves. So the question asked, what do you think your risk of addiction associated with opioids is? And so you see that the vast majority of patients identified that they did not think that they themselves were at risk of becoming addicted to opioid medications. The yellow bar, the question was, what do you think the risk is for the general public? And they found that, yes, we think there's a very high risk for the general public. So there's kind of that, difference between what I think my personal risk is and what I think the general public's risk is. You can go on to the next slide. So we take those data, Dr. Winstanley presented them, and we start to develop Tpose. So we were funded through WVCTSI. We had a phase 1 where we pilot tested our content, which I'll talk about. And then we did a small randomized clinical trial in phase 2 that compared education with that website to usual care, which is what questions do you have about your medication? And we did these at 2 hospitals, one in Morgantown at Ruby Memorial and one here in Huntington at St. Mary's Medical Center. You can go on to the next slide. The content we included included expanding those original educational materials, but we expanded it to web-based resources. So it was that we actually created our whole own website for this education. And so it wasn't just that standalone brochure. They could actually go, and we have items like interactive maps where they can see drug, where do I live at? Where's the closest drug disposal location? Where do I live at? Where's the closest pharmacy that distributes naloxone? So it could be very interactive and tailored to their particular information. We also had a lot of web-based resources we added in because we weren't limited to what we could get on the trifold brochure or the single page handout. And we included information about tolerance, specifically about knowing which products may also contain acetaminophen to promote acetaminophen safety, the cough syrups with codeine, pregnancy and opioids and their impact, poison control centers, and then also some information for parents who may have a child or a teen who was prescribed opioids. You can go on to the next slide. And so this was what our landing page looked like. We worked with an amazing web designer who was here from Marshall. He is actually one of our instructional designers here at the School of Pharmacy, and we borrowed him for this project because his second love was website design. And so when you logged into the site, you could follow it through, and you could hit the begin here, and you could follow it through in the way that we logically thought of when we were laying out all the material. So if you just followed the button at the bottom of each page and clicked begin here, next, it would lay through, it would start with all the information about prescription pain relievers, go into Narcan, opioid overdoses, and then our information. If you as a patient didn't want to go through that stepwise, or if there was 1 or 2 particular pieces of information you were more interested in, you could use the bars at the top and self-navigate to whichever section you so desired. You can go on to the next slide. So this was an example of the pages. We did our best to keep this below a 6th grade reading level. This page specifically was a little bit above, primarily because we included the medication names. And anytime you include the brand and generic names of medication, it will increase your reading level. But we did our best to keep it down to the 6th grade reading level or below. We tried to make it very visual with pictures when appropriate, and like I said, anything that we could do interactive. You can go on to the next slide. So we put the website together and we did a cross-sectional study of 43 patients. In our pilot study, we included patients who was 18 to 70 years old who were being discharged from the hospital with an opioid prescription. So while not part of our inclusion criteria, based on the changes in opioid prescribing, this ended up being a lot of surgical patients. So at St. Mary's, we targeted the ortho and neurosurgery floors, so a lot of joint replacements, spinal surgeries, and Ruby targeted, I believe it was their ortho and trauma floors as well. And so in our exclusion criteria were current cancer diagnosis or terminal illness, or if they already reported non-medical use of either opioids or use of heroin. You can go on to the next slide. So it took participants about 13 minutes on average to go through all of our material. Less than half of those participants reported previously receiving this type of information. So they had received opioids before, but they still hadn't received this type of information when they had been prescribed. And they 89% believe that all patients should receive this type of education before taking an opioid medication. We also did a general information about how the website worked, taking from the IT world to make sure that the content, the navigation, the visual aspects of the website, and they were all positive as well. And so we took this information and finalized website content. Some big things that happened was we had a lot of questions about disposal of medications when they had a septic tank, thinking that the don't flush things down the toilet did not apply if they had a septic tank because it's not going into the water supply. So we had to find, we added some resources based on the types of questions we got after they went through it, and things that we were commonly hearing over and over, we added information to. We also expanded our maps. When we originally started, because we were pilot testing this to get it up and going, our maps for drug disposal and naloxone only included the direct areas where we were doing the study, so the Huntington area, the Morgantown area. But we found that because both locations are tertiary centers, they were seeing patients from much wider and even out of state. So we started to add the neighboring states and filling in the rest of our state map there as well. You can go on to the next slide. We asked the same types of questions about the perceived risk of addiction to prescription opioids and found that they feel that their personal risk is very low. The general public's risk is high to extremely high. You can go on to the next slide. And the same thing holds true when we asked them this time also about the risk of opioid overdose. So they think their risk is low, the general public's is higher. You can go on to the next slide. So once we got through phase 2, we started our clinical trial of this education. And so we did a randomized controlled trial. We did change our inclusion criteria a little bit, and we increased our upper age limit from 70 to 75. And this was honestly because we found that we had a lot of patients in phase 1 that we provided the education to, but that they could not participate in the data collection portion because they were between that 70 and 75 years of age. And so when we started our phase 2 project, we decided to go ahead and increase that upper age limit just based on the demographics that we had seen during phase 1. And they must still have been discharged from the hospital with a prescription for an opioid. And we excluded patients with a current cancer diagnosis or terminal illness, and if they had previously reported non-medical use of opioids or heroin. We collected baseline data on prior use of prescription opioids, family history of alcohol or substance abuse, and the self-perceived risk of addiction. You can go on to the next slide. Our participants were randomized to either receive the Tpose intervention, like the same intervention we did, just tweaked and improved from phase 1, or to receive usual care, which was going in, just doing the basic, you will be being sent home on this medication. What questions do you have about it? We did stratify the randomization by site, gender, and then also the type of procedure that they were having and being discharged from the hospital for. We used student pharmacists to conduct the patient counseling or on either the usual care or the Tpose website. You can go on to the next slide. We then contacted them at 1 month and 3 months after discharge for follow-up, and we gained information regarding their continued use or if they have stopped the prescription opioids. Also, if they had stopped it, how had they disposed of it? And we also, once again, collected their self-perceived risk of addiction. We had 103 patients we initially screened. 99 of those were eligible. And then after we found out that they were eligible, we had 2 who decided not to participate. So we ended up randomizing 97 patients. 2 of those withdrew after randomization. But we had 49 usual care and 46 in the Tpose intervention. And we had 59 who we was able to complete follow-up for at 1 month, and 49 that we were able to complete follow-up for at 3 months. You can go on to the next slide. 89.5% of our participants had taken a prescription opioid in the past, and 47% said that they had previously received information on the safe use, storage, or disposal. We did initially ask about that we asked the question that the National Survey on Drug Use and Health uses to assess non-medical use, and we only had 2 participants endorse it at that point in time. And so at that point we started looking, because then we asked further questions, and it was actually by complete accident in our database we realized that we had not turned on skip logic. So we had initially had it to where we asked the general question about non-medical use of prescription opioids. And the way we had intended it to be was if they said no, then that was the end. And if they said yes, then we would go on and find out further reasons why they were using prescription opioids non-medically. That skip logic didn't work, and so we were still asking those questions. And so we found out that patients were reporting, yes, I'm taking this to help me sleep. Yes, I'm taking it to help me get to work in the morning. And so we went back and started reviewing how we was wording that question. And you can go on to the next slide. So we ended up modifying it. And then, so pre-modification, we'd only had 2 patients say yes. After the modification, we had 67 participants endorsed at least one other item other than taking it for their physical pain. And so I think this showed us a lot, like we didn't mean to find this result, but how are we asking our patients about potential non-medical use of prescription opioids can be very important. You can go on to the next slide. Most patients were aware of the risk of addiction. However, they felt that they were not themselves at risk. And 68% believed that they could reduce the risk of addiction to prescription opioids. You can go on to the next slide. On follow-up, we found out that 48.8% of participants reported that they received information on safe use from their dispensing pharmacy. 49.1% reported that they really wanted to stop the opioid completely, or at least cut down how much they were taking it. We had 4 participants who reported concern that they may become addicted. 1 participant reported borrowing a prescription opioid. Other than that, no other non-medical use was reported. And 8 patients had tried to obtain another prescription after their initial prescription that they were discharged on. You can go on to the next slide. They did recall information more significantly in the Tpose group. So at 30 days follow-up in the Tpose group, 46.2% recalled information on how to safely store their prescriptions compared to 18.2% in usual care. How to safely dispose of. That was one thing that we really, I think our education did really well on in Tpose, was how do you safely dispose of your prescription medications. So 61.5% at 30 days remembered that. and 18.2% in the usual care. And patients in the Tpose group were more likely to understand the side effects, and even the disposal information held up at 90 days. 61% remembered at 30 days how do you dispose of, and that was up to 68.2% of those that we was able to complete in the 90-day follow-up remembered. Participants in usual care could have still received information at discharge because ethically that's what was right. We couldn't just say, no, you don't get any information. So they could have still given information and been given information if they had asked about some of these specific questions. And then also we can't really control for what information they may have received at their dispensing pharmacy. You can go on to the next slide. So our conclusions was we did have an improvement in knowledge and behaviors from the Tpose intervention. We are still looking at the rest of our information following. We had a lot of patients, primarily neurosurgery patients, who had received both an opioid and benzodiazepine at discharge. So we're wanting to look in further at if there's any differences in the patients who received an opioid and a benzo versus just an opioid, and then any kind of demographic differences in prescribing, since we do have two areas of the state that we can compare. We can go on to the next slide. Our real big thing is that we want this type of education more integrated into like your patient portals that are required with the EHR, and that, you know, all patients who are being prescribed opioids get this education. My big goal is to start to translate this to point of dispensing in combination with screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. So at the pharmacies, patients being screened and either provided the education or referred to treatment as appropriate based on those screenings. And you can go on to the next slide. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Brittany. We really appreciate you putting this together and taking the time to share your research with everyone. Did anyone have any questions or even comments for Brittany? Feel free to unmute or chat in.
I have a question. Was there any incentive for the patients to complete the reading portion that they had to do on their own, or is this something that you think patients will be naturally motivated to do on their own?
So as far as incentives, they were given, if they completed the initial intervention, they were given a $10 gift card. And then if they completed the follow-ups, they were given gift cards. What we found was that the patients really wanted the information. We also had a captive audience because we were doing it on the day of discharge, and a lot of them were post-op joint patients. So if you've ever worked with a joint replacement patient on discharge day, they have a lot of hurry up and wait. So hurry up and get to morning physical therapy, and then hurry up and wait until afternoon physical therapy. And then if I do well at afternoon physical therapy, I can be discharged. And so we caught them where they were that captive audience, where they were just waiting on that next step in their discharge process. And so that took a lot of coordination with the nurse managers on the floor to find out like which patients were scheduled for therapy at what time, what the discharge order was going to be. But I think that a part of our success in them reading it was the fact that they were a captive audience in the hospital room.
One of the things that interests me about patients with pain is kind of the active versus passive approach to self-management. And so a lot of patients kind of are passive and just receive care, and they're not very active in their own health care. And anything we can do to make patients more active, I think, is great. I just wonder, you know, if there'll be a problem motivating people to embrace the intervention. You know, if the patient experience is positive enough that they'll do it on their own.
Yeah, and so we tried to make the website very simple to use, very informational. And we did have a few patients saying, hey, I need to show, like, can I get this link because I want to show this to such and such who I know is taking a prescription opioid. I want to take this to such and such. And so I think that it does come back to that. How do you motivate it? How do you approach the information with the patient? Because I could see in a world where they're not a captive audience and they're not incentivized, where they may just say, it's the same thing as the paper, mailers that they get in their prescription bag, trash can, and on out the door they go. So that can be a very big problem.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Dr. Hirschler, for the question. Any other comments or thoughts from anyone? I'm reminding myself that the 10 to 15 seconds of silence is okay. I want to give you all some time to process and think of questions too, so please bear with my awkward silence. Alrighty, well, if there are any questions after the fact for Brittany, just as always, feel free to shoot me an email and make sure to send them to her so she can have them addressed. And we really, really appreciate it, Brittany. Great presentation and super interesting. We're getting chats as well, thanking you for the great presentation. So we truly appreciate it. And thank you for putting your email in the chat as well. I'll make sure to include your PowerPoint in the recap email that I send out, so everyone will make sure to have that last slide, and if they need to reach out to you, they can.
Sounds great.
Cheryl, I do see that you have just a general question. I can just open it up to that as well. So I'll just turn things to you, Cheryl, for the question.
Thank you.
Cheryl, it's a little difficult to hear.
Yes, we have a special case that a patient is unable to, still can't hear me?
It's coming in and out a little bit. It might be your connection. We can hear a little bit though.
Try shutting off the video and just talking.
Yeah, sometimes turning the video off. Thank you, Dr. Husted. Sometimes turning your video off might help.
Okay, is that any better?
That's much better, yes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the suggestion. Yes. So Dr. Bo and I were discussing a case. We have a patient that can't go in for urine drug screens due to his health. Does anyone know of any rules or laws as far as the state of West Virginia that prohibit, say, the home health agency from completing this since they're in the patient's home twice a week?
I think home health routinely does lab work on patients. If someone's on an antibiotic and they need to get levels of the antibiotic, or they do all kinds of lab work. I think that would be routine care for home health.
Yeah, I'll say I hope there's no law against it, because I've done it. We had a guy who was homebound, well, not homebound, but unable to come in for medical reasons. And we worked with home health to get urine drug screens, and that seemed like a good solution for that situation at the time.
That's my understanding as well. I think that the policy is more to.
Okay, so then you just send the order over to the home health agency. That way the program could show that they.
Right. You just need the result in your chart. It doesn't necessarily have to be performed by you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You just have to have the result in your chart, the treatment chart, but it doesn't necessarily have to be performed by you or your clinic.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you all. Did anyone else have any comments to Cheryl's question? Awesome. And Cheryl, did you have any other questions, or anyone else with other questions they'd like to ask?
No, I had no other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. anyone else? I don't want to end the session too short. If there are any other questions or comments or anything anyone would like to share with the group. Alrighty, I'll give you guys 22 minutes back to your Monday. Thank you so much again, Brittany, for the presentation, and thank you all for the questions and comments and everything. We truly appreciate it. The only announcement that I do have is our next session is on March 8th, and Laura Lander and Emily Chilko are going to present their didactic on teletherapy for OUD and co-occurring disorders. And they also have prepared a video for the mock teletherapy session. So I know some of you guys on the call today too were participating in that. So Katie, I see you, Katie and Phil, I see you both hiding your faces and scratching, but no, it's gonna be so awesome. And I hope you all can make it to that one because it'll be really interactive and collaborative. The one thing we are sort of requesting from you all is to bring any examples you have of group therapy, whether that's in person or teletherapy. Anything you guys have, just bring it to the session and we'll try to make it as collaborative as possible. So keep an eye out for that reminder, and we're super excited for that. So we'll see you guys next time. Thank you. Bye.